Late winter, 1944. Before dawn breaks over southern England, the ground begins to tremble. In the market town of Weymouth, Dorset, blackout curtains twitch as a low, unbroken rumble rolls in from the east. It is not bombing. It does not fade. It grows. A British woman at her upstairs window watches headlights emerge from the darkness, one after another, until the high street disappears beneath them. Trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, tanks. Olive drab columns stretching beyond sight, moving with patient, mechanical certainty. They do not stop. For 3 days, the convoys pass. American soldiers sit high in their vehicles, helmets tilted back, chewing gum, grinning, waving at strangers they have never met. Their accents float up through the cold air, loud, confident, unmistakably foreign. To civilians who have lived 4 years under ration books and air raid sirens, the scene feels unreal, like a film spilling into real life. By early 1944, more than 1 million American servicemen have arrived in Britain, and suddenly they are everywhere, filling streets, pubs, cinemas, village lanes. For British civilians, the war has been long, restrained, endured quietly. This new presence feels different, brighter, heavier, impossible to ignore. What people said, standing at those windows and street corners, would reveal far more than surprise. It would expose admiration, resentment, confusion, hope, and the uneasy understanding that something vast was about to happen just beyond the Channel. That understanding settled in slowly, shaped by years of war that came before it. By the time American troops began filling Britain's streets, the war had already carved deep lines into British civilian life. Since September 1939, Britain had lived under conditions of total war. Food rationing tightened year after year. Clothing coupons limited even basic necessities. Cities carried the scars of the Blitz, their rebuilt streets standing beside empty lots where bombs had fallen. Nightly blackouts and air raid drills had become routine. For many civilians, war was not a distant concept, but a constant physical presence, heard in sirens, felt in hunger, measured in absence. From June 1940 until late 1941, Britain had stood effectively alone against Nazi Germany. France had fallen. Much of Europe lay under occupation. The Royal Air Force had survived the Battle of Britain by narrow margins, while the Royal Navy fought a grinding, invisible war in the Atlantic.
When the United States entered the conflict after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, relief was real, but so was the awareness that help would not arrive overnight. That help began to take shape in early 1942 under Operation Bolero, the code name for the massive buildup of American forces in the British Isles. Ports were expanded, airfields were carved out of farmland, rail lines were reinforced, warehouses rose quietly along country roads. At first, the numbers were manageable. American units arrived in waves that could be absorbed without disrupting daily life too dramatically. But as the war turned toward the question of a return to Western Europe, the scale changed. By late 1943, Britain was no longer simply a nation at war. It had become the staging ground for the largest amphibious invasion in history, and the signs were becoming impossible for civilians to miss. That transformation would soon remake the entire landscape of southern England. By the winter of 1943, southern England had begun to disappear beneath the weight of preparation. Counties like Devon, Dorset, Hampshire, Cornwall, and much of East Anglia were transformed into what was, in effect, one vast military zone. Fields that had grown wheat and barley were flattened and paved into airstrips. Hedgerows were cut back to widen roads for heavy vehicles. Railway sidings multiplied, feeding ports that now pulsed day and night with cargo arriving from across the Atlantic. The numbers were staggering. 5 million American servicemen were stationed in Britain. Infantry divisions, airborne units, engineers, medical staff, air crews, an entire army in waiting. Their equipment followed them in endless tonnage, tanks wrapped in protective grease, crates of ammunition, landing craft stacked along riverbanks, fuel dumps hidden beneath camouflage netting. British civilians were not told the details, but they understood the pattern. This was not defensive. This was not temporary. This was preparation for movement, eastward, across the Channel. The government attempted to soften the impact. Local councils coordinated billeting, requisitioning homes, schools, and village halls. Civilians were reminded that hosting Allied troops was a contribution to victory. Meanwhile, American soldiers arriving in Britain were issued a small booklet titled A Short Guide to Great Britain. It warned them that the British were reserved, that understatement mattered, that cues were sacred, and that boasting was poorly received.
The British received no such guide. Instead, they received the Americans themselves, confident, well-fed, unfamiliar with shortages, and suddenly omnipresent. The contrast between the two societies could not have been sharper. British restraint met American abundance on narrow streets never designed for such encounters. Beneath the surface, both sides sensed the same unspoken truth. These men were not here to stay. They were here to leave, together, and soon. And that awareness would shape every interaction that followed, coloring how civilians watched, judged, welcomed, and sometimes resented the strangers in uniform. Those judgments would crystallize in the things people said, joked about, and whispered once the Americans were among them. The first angle was simple and immediate: appearance. British civilians noticed it the moment American soldiers stepped into their towns. They were taller on average, broader in the shoulders, better fed. Years of rationing had left British bodies lean and restrained. American uniforms seemed to hang on men who had never known hunger. Their jackets were newer, their boots cleaner, their equipment plentiful. To many observers, they looked less like soldiers of a desperate war and more like men arriving from another world. Then there was the money. American pay was dramatically higher than that of British servicemen, and civilians saw the effects almost instantly. In pubs, Americans bought rounds without hesitation. They tipped generously. They ordered food that British soldiers rarely could. For civilians used to careful counting, this casual spending felt shocking, sometimes obscene. British soldiers felt this contrast most sharply. Many had been fighting since 1939. They had survived Dunkirk, North Africa, the Atlantic. Now, on leave, they found themselves competing for attention with men who arrived late but flush with confidence and cash. Resentment simmered quietly at first, then erupted in arguments and occasional brawls. Military police from both nations were soon required to patrol together. Yet alongside irritation came fascination. To British ears, this informality felt intrusive, even disrespectful, but it was also disarming. Civilians argued among themselves about whether this confidence was arrogance or simply youth untouched by years of war. Those debates deepened as more parts of British society, women, children, and shopkeepers, were drawn into daily contact with the Americans.
And nowhere was the contrast more sharply felt than in the lives of those least protected from scarcity. For British women and children, the American presence registered in different ways. Children noticed first what they could hold. American soldiers, many barely out of adolescence themselves, handed out chewing gum, chocolate bars, and sweets with an ease that astonished parents. These were luxuries British children had not seen in years. Mothers recorded the change with mixed emotions: gratitude, embarrassment, and a quiet ache at how little they themselves could provide. Women noticed other things. American soldiers brought nylon stockings, lipstick, perfume, items long vanished from British shops. Dances organized for Allied troops filled halls across southern England. American music dominated them. Swing, jazz, jitterbug rhythms replaced the more restrained styles British society had known. Older generations watched with concern as young women were spun across floors by confident strangers who talked about futures far beyond ration books and bomb shelters. Beneath this lay deeper tensions. The American military arrived segregated, and its racial divisions clashed with British civilian norms. When American commanders requested that pubs and social venues separate black and white soldiers, many proprietors refused outright. Incidents followed. In June 1943, violence erupted in Bamber Bridge after American military police attempted to enforce segregation. One black soldier was killed. For British civilians, the event was shocking, not only for its violence, but for what it revealed about the contradictions within the Allied cause. Meanwhile, entire communities near American air bases lived under a new rhythm. In East Anglia, the daily thunder of B-17s and B-24s lifting into the sky became routine. Civilians learned to count returning aircraft, to notice gaps, to understand what absence meant without being told. Through generosity and friction, excitement and unease, one reality pressed in on everyone. These interactions were temporary. The Americans were not settling in. They were waiting.
And as the spring of 1944 approached, that waiting began to tighten into something far more ominous. Because soon, preparation would give way to departure. By the spring of 1944, the waiting ended. Across southern England, the tempo of preparation accelerated to a level civilians had never witnessed before. Movement orders multiplied. Road signs vanished overnight.
Entire stretches of coastline were sealed behind barbed wire and armed guards. Conversation in pubs lowered to cautious murmurs, not because people knew more, but because they sensed they should say less. In December 1943, the scale of what was coming became brutally clear in Devon's South Hams. Thousands of civilians living around Slapton Sands were ordered to evacuate their homes with only weeks' notice. Farms, villages, and coastal roads were requisitioned so American forces could rehearse amphibious landings. For families rooted in the same land for generations, the order felt sudden and harsh, but final. The beaches, authorities explained, resembled those in northern France. Training had to be exact. In April 1944, during Exercise Tiger, that realism turned deadly. SS servicemen. Details were immediately classified. British civilians saw only fragments, ambulances rushing through the night, increased security, strained faces. But the silence itself confirmed the stakes. This was no rehearsal anymore. People understood that mistakes now meant real deaths. By May, southern England resembled a loaded spring. Landing craft crowded harbors, fields filled with tanks masked under nets. Convoys rolled continuously, day and night. American soldiers grew quieter. The joking thinned. Letters were written and rewritten. Some gave away spare belongings to British friends, small tokens that felt suddenly significant. Civilians sensed the shift. The Americans who had once seemed loud and carefree now carried themselves differently. Not fearful exactly, but focused, inward. Everyone knew what this meant, even if no one said it aloud. And then, on a single night, the waiting finally broke. The night of June 5, 1944, arrived without ceremony. Darkness settled over southern England as it had thousands of times before, but this time the stillness did not last. Shortly before midnight, engines ignited across towns and villages. The sound spread outward, swelling into a continuous roar as convoys began to move. Trucks, tanks, artillery, and landing vehicles rolled toward ports in disciplined columns. Headlights dimmed, orders shouted low and fast. British civilians emerged into doorways and streets despite blackout rules. No one stopped them. They stood in coats and slippers, children clutched close, watching an entire army pass through their lives one final time.
American soldiers waved from trucks, forcing smiles, calling out half-jokes to people whose names they would never know. Some threw chocolate, others tossed addresses scribbled on scraps of paper. Many said nothing at all. In ports like Southampton, Portsmouth, and Weymouth, the scale was overwhelming. Landing craft pressed hull to hull. Ships waited in rows that stretched into the darkness. The air smelled of fuel, salt, and cold metal. British dock workers and volunteers watched silently as men they had fed, argued with, laughed at, and welcomed prepared to leave. By dawn on June 6th, the streets were empty. The BBC announced that Allied forces had landed on the coast of Normandy. The words traveled quickly through Britain, carried by radios turned up in kitchens, shops, and factories. For civilians, the invasion was no longer something approaching. It was happening, now, on foreign beaches where the men they had watched depart were fighting and dying. The jokes stopped, so did the complaints. In towns that had been crowded only hours before, a heavy quiet settled in. British civilians understood, with sudden clarity, that many of the faces they remembered would never return. The Americans who had filled their streets were now part of history unfolding in real time, beyond reach, beyond help. What remained was the reckoning, what those months of friction and familiarity now meant. In the days following D-Day, Britain listened. Radio stayed on from morning until night, carrying cautious reports from Normandy. Casualty figures were delayed, incomplete, spoken carefully. British civilians scanned maps in newspapers, tracing unfamiliar French villages where the Americans they have known might now be fighting. Names meant little, faces meant everything. The emotional shift was immediate and unmistakable. Resentments that had once felt sharp now seemed small, even embarrassing. The jokes about money, manners, and swagger lost their bite. What remained was a sober recognition of cost. These were no longer noisy foreigners clogging narrow streets. They were soldiers under fire, far from home, doing work that Britain alone could not finish. Mass observation diarists captured the change with clarity. Civilians wrote of guilt for past irritations, of pride mixed with fear, of an aching sense of distance. One woman recorded that she kept thinking about a young American who used to buy sweets for her children, wondering if he had survived his first day in France.
She would never know. Churches filled again, this time not during air raids, but during quiet daylight hours. Prayers were said not only for British sons and husbands, but for the Americans as well. In pubs, conversations softened, arguments faded. When newsreels showed beaches crowded with men and equipment, British audiences leaned forward, searching for something familiar in the grainy images. The invasion had transformed memory itself. The Americans were no longer an intrusion into wartime Britain. They had become part of its sacrifice. And as the weeks passed, civilians began to feel the absence more sharply than they had ever felt the presence. That absence would linger long after the fighting moved inland. As summer advanced, the physical traces of the American presence began to thin. Convoys no longer clogged market streets. Dance halls fell quiet. Children learned that asking for gum no longer worked. In towns that had once strained under the weight of soldiers and vehicles, a strange calm returned, welcome but unsettling. Civilians spoke of the silence as much as they had once complained about the noise. In places like the South Hams, evacuated families were slowly allowed to return. They found landscapes altered by war games, rutted roads, damaged fields, abandoned huts, shell casings rusting into the soil. Homes stood where they had been left, but they felt different, as if something essential had passed through and moved on. Across Britain, the Americans left deeper marks than debris. Tens of thousands of relationships endured beyond the invasion. By war's end, around 70,000 British women would marry American servicemen, becoming GI brides bound for a country many had known only through stories. Others were left waiting, uncertain whether the men they loved would return at all. Children carried memories forward, of accents, of music, of a generosity that seemed limitless in a time of scarcity. British society, long insular, had been opened abruptly to another way of living, another sense of possibility. The alliance had not been smooth. It had been crowded, loud, unequal, and often uncomfortable. But it had worked. And as Britain watched the war move eastward into France, then beyond, civilians understood that the strange months when America filled their streets had marked a turning point, not just in the war, but in their own sense of what victory would cost.
All that remained now was to reckon with what it had meant. Looking back, the arrival of American troops in Britain before D-Day was more than a logistical necessity. It was a collision of cultures, economies, and lives under pressure of history. Civilians had endured 4 years of rationing, fear, and uncertainty. Into that world poured young men from a distant continent, brash, confident, and frighteningly well supplied. Yet, beneath the jokes, frustrations, and occasional fights, there was a shared understanding. These Americans had crossed an ocean to fight a war that was, at first, not theirs. Their presence was chaotic and disruptive, but also sustaining. They brought hope in chocolate, cigarettes, music, and attention, but also in the unspoken truth that the tide of the war was about to turn. For British civilians, the experience was layered. They remembered the wealth and noise, the strange customs, the unfair advantages, and the minor resentments. But they also remembered generosity, courage, and the sacrifices made on foreign beaches.
They learned that a war fought alongside others demanded both tolerance and recognition. Tolerance for difference, recognition of shared purpose. In the end, the Americans left Britain altered, physically, socially, emotionally. Towns emptied, streets quieted, but memories lingered, of laughter and arguments, dances and parades, chocolate and gum, and the bittersweet farewells on the night convoys rolled away. Those memories were not simple, and they were not easy, but they reflected something profound, that in the darkest months, human connection, messy, complicated, sometimes flawed, could shine through, even in the shadow of war. It was this complicated, living memory that defined what British civilians said and felt about the Americans who filled their streets before D-Day. Loud, brash, overpaid, and oversexed they may have been, but brave, generous, and human, they were unquestionably indispensable. And in that, the history of the streets of Britain in 1944 finds its truest measure.